second for the notification to come up on Facebook.
I'm seeing here that we are live.
Okay. We are live. We are live on Facebook and our YouTube page. Welcome to Community First Schools Virtual Summit 2020. We are so happy to be joined by two very special guests, and we will introduce them in just a moment. But I wanted to just first set the stage of who Community First School is, who we are, that you see here on your screen, and what we intend to cover in today's virtual summit. This is a two-part summit. We're here for the first hour from 12 to noon. We welcome your questions and your comments along the way, but we want you to come back later on this evening from 6 to 7:30 when we do part two of the virtual summit. And we have a really broad range of panelists that will be joining that conversation to continue the conversation that we kick off right here, right now, and really grounded in purpose and education. But the theme for today's summit is respond, rebuild, and reimagine. And we're going to talk about all of that this hour. My name is Naisha McCauley, and I am the board chair of Community First School. Community First School is opening this August 2020 in the north end of Hartford, Connecticut. For anyone watching in other parts of the world, know that we are an independent school, really launched on a belief that something was wrong, basically, with education of Black and brown children. So we are responding today to that call, and that really is the founding of Community First School. It's our response to a call of what I have seen personally as a parent growing up in the city of Hartford, involved heavily in advocating for quality education for children in the city, but joining forces with others. And one of those people I joined arms with in the call to improve the quality of education for our children is joining me on this conversation is Tim Goodwin. And Tim is the founder of Community First School, and really it comes out of his desire in responding to the call of what he was seeing as an educator in the city of Hartford, as an administrator in the city of Hartford, to what was not happening for our children. And so we wanted to talk about that today. Obviously, when we first set out to have this conversation, it was pre-COVID-19. It was pre the social unrest that we see now with the killing of George Floyd. But I think even more so, this conversation is needed because of those events. We were talking about purpose in education. We were talking about the inequities in education prior to that. But I think what has happened is we are seeing an awakening in which this conversation can be had by everyone. In new and different ways. And so I welcome you again to our 2020 virtual summit, Community First School Summit. And I want to introduce you to Tim Goodwin. He is the founder of Community First School, to introduce our guests and get us started with today's conversation. Tim.
Thank you, Naisha.
How you doing?
Thank you, Naisha. I want to just acknowledge you as a strong, courageous, and compassionate board chair. It's an honor to serve under you, and I'm very thankful to have you at my side as we move in this direction to open Community First School in August. The two panelists that we have today, we're very fortunate and very blessed. Carlos Brown is Regional Vice President at St. Francis Hospital Trinity Health. He oversees diversity and inclusion and community health and wellness, which are two founding principles of Community First School. And we have Dr. Nicholas Pierce out of Chicago. He wrote a book called The Purpose Path, which I read during the pandemic, which was inspirational to me. Fundraising screeched to a halt during that time period, and it was your book, Dr. Pierce, that allowed me to keep the faith, because I said, I'm in this for a greater purpose. And regardless of the circumstances, we can keep going and God will provide even during the hard times. So that book was powerful for me. I thank you for it. Dr. Pierce is also a professor at Northwestern University, Kellogg School of Management. He is the assistant pastor at the Apostolic Church of God in Chicago and CEO of the Vocati Group, which works throughout the world to help executives find their purpose in management. So welcome, both of you. Before we get to the essential questions of responding, rebuilding, and reimagining education, I do want to acknowledge St. Francis Trinity Health. I've been in education for about 30 years, over 10 of which were spent in administration, 18 years in the classroom, 3 years as administrator in Hartford Public Schools. And the conversation we're about to have today around structured racism and things of that nature, if we had that back during my time as an administrator, you could guarantee that within 24 hours I get a phone call. Tim, you need to stop this conversation. Insubordination, I can't tell you how many times I was told I was going to die on a hill, whatever that means. But the reality is there's a culture of fear of repercussion in public education, especially in our cities. And we can't have that anymore. The fact that we're an independent, nonprofit organization means that we don't have to fear repercussion, but we also don't get city or state funding. So today we will also be looking to share a little bit in terms of our fundraising goals. On the screen, you will see at times, we'll take some pauses to look at some fundraising. It's going to be coming up momentarily. St. Francis Hospital Trinity Health has made a significant sponsorship donation to Community First School. We want to match that today in this first hour and then later on this evening. Without your support, we can't have the autonomous voice that we're going to have. We, as Naisha said, planned this prior to the pandemic. And St. Francis stayed with us even when it was no longer a live event. We can't tell you how important that is to us and how grateful we are to St. Francis Trinity Health for doing that. And we are so excited to have Carlos here today to share a little bit about that partnership. We need your support. If you're interested today in supporting us, text in the message box CFS-2020 to number 44-321. When you text that code, CFS-2020, to the number 44321, you will be given a link that will enable you to see this screen and make a donation. And if you want it to be anonymous, you check that anonymous box, but you can help us meet our goals to serve North Hartford children and families and end structured racism today, if you'd like, by making a donation. Just want to put that up there before we begin. And now we will head back to our meeting. And to Carlos, I'll give it to you so you can share a little bit about why you've made this partnership as an organization, and you can kick us off before I get into the heart of the discussion with Dr. Pierce.
Thanks, Tim. So happy to be here and so grateful to be with Dr. Pierce and look forward to his commentary and learning a lot about leadership and understanding social injustice. So when St. Francis heard the call, it was clear that we needed to respond. And as we heard what you were looking to do, we knew we wanted to be on the foundation to help rebuild. But more importantly, we really, really see the vision that the organization has and the shared vision that it has with us in terms of what we want to do within the community, especially within the Promise Zone, within Hartford. And we hope to be a partner in reimagining what it is that our future for these young people can be. And we look forward to all that's going to come from both the school and the leadership and the teachers and the community uniting to make a difference. So with that, I will pass it back to you, Tim.
Thank you so much. And again, thank you for sticking with us through this pandemic. You guys are on the front lines in so many ways, but yet still took time to support our work in the community. So thank you again. Dr. Pierce, so excited to have you with us today.
I'm excited to be with you. Thank you again for having me.
You bet. So we're talking about education. We're talking about reimagining it. And in your book, The Purpose Path, you talk about purpose in all areas of life, for a teenager, for someone in their 20s, for someone who's maybe in the middle or end of their career. And you talk about a reason for being. in education today, having been in it for 30 years, we don't talk about purpose very often. We talk about standardized test scores. We talk about data diving, whatever that means. I'm really still not quite sure. But we don't talk about reason for being. We don't talk about purpose, but it seems to me that's what really engages a human being in being a human being. And it starts that love of learning for life. So I would like you to just share a little bit about your experience, what you wrote in the book, about this concept of reason for being. We want this to kick off our entire conversation, not just now, but even at 6 o'clock tonight.
Sure. Well, again, I want to express my gratitude to you, Tim, and to Naisha, and to all of those who have been a part of making not only this day possible, but are behind the effort to make the Community First School a reality and a success in the North Hartford area. It is truly refreshing to be a part of a conversation with people who have not only vision, but also the know-how to make this work for our young people. Usually, you either have people who are throwing rocks at the brokenness in our world's systems, but don't have the actual skills to build something in place of what's broken, or you have people who are within those broken systems who are advocating for slow reform. And as you mentioned with COVID-19, this is certainly not a time for incremental change. This is a time for really looking at the heart of the matter and making clear-headed judgments and taking courageous steps to make what should be the reality, the reality. So my hat is off to you and your team, and my prayers are with you. Your question about purpose does really lie at the heart of all of this, because purpose, as you mentioned, is truly about a reason for being. And this is not only true of individuals, but also organizations. A lot of us have gone out figuring out how we can be better at doing what we do. We figure out the how-tos and the how to do it betters and the what to do's and the what technologies to use, and we're caught up so much in the what and the how and perfecting and refining our what's and our how's that we don't start with why. Yet, baked into the what's and the how's that we choose to focus on is a theory about why. Right? So the data diving and the standardized testing and all of the things that we see as the scorecards in education have been put there with an underlying notion that these are the right metrics to be able to figure out whether a kid is going to be successful in life, right? It's to try to figure out whether education is working on their behalf. Yet, what I'm so thrilled about with what you're thinking about with Community First Schools is trying to really rewind and take a hard look at the foundation and ask what are the fundamental premises upon which we actually think education should exist, right? And when I think about education and the purpose of education, particularly, there are a few areas that I'm inclined to think about. One is that undeniably education exists to prepare young people or even people who are more advanced in years to be able to take advantage of professional opportunity. There is a utilitarian function in the way that education has worked. There is also, if we're completely honest, a business function, right? Because the education sector and the education technology sector and all of the sort of ancillary functions that are in and around education certainly are ways that people in our country and around the world are employed, right? Certainly I'm among them. I am a professor in a university, right? And so education also has a function to play as an employer or a place of work. And then the other piece, and I really think about this in conjunction with some of the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., thinking that education does have a moral component. We do have a responsibility to prepare not only the next generation, but to sharpen each other, to recognize that no matter how economically or academically prepared or prosperous we may be, there is a moral responsibility that we all have. And working with young people in a community first school setting is a place where you're not only trying to create concepts of literacy and mathematical literacy and dexterity in the sciences, etc., but there's also a moral foundation that we have to lay that says no matter how many skills I develop, how I use those skills is critical. to support human flourishing, and to also glorify God in a spiritual fashion, right? And so I think the merging of the moral with the utilitarian can be really, really important for all of us to consider.
One of the things that Naisha, go ahead, jump in.
No. Go ahead, Tim.
Well, I was going to say, you mentioned the professional aspect, the business aspect, the moral aspect. To me, one of the things I saw in public education in our urban centers, mostly Hartford, but also I think it's similar in other urban centers across the country, is it's just not equal for folks in urban settings. So there may be the professional aspect. You have an education system that seems to be creating rather compliant, passive individuals who can sit quietly, sit still, and just move through the system without critical thinking or purpose. And what that does to students who are in an urban area like Hartford, there's no real engagement. And what ends up happening is you're sort of being prepared, it seems, for low-wage service, sometimes even incarceration. And in terms of the business aspect, it seems like the business of urban education is to promote those things. Maybe a few exceptional black and brown people can make it out, but the majority aren't going to make it anyway. So we just move them down these sort of paths into not very positive professional careers. And then the moral piece is completely vacant in terms of teaching, because the other pieces have become so important that the moral piece, the passion, the family, the forgiveness, things that need to be built are not being built because the focus is elsewhere. How do we start to rectify that? How do we start to bring that purpose in? Because your zip code determines what type of education you get, and it determines how professional you will be able to be.
Absolutely. One of the things that we've determined in healthcare is 70%, over 50% rather, of what you can determine as your health is decided by the zip code that you live in. We can tell you that it's not your genetics, it's not what medication you're on, it's not the kind of care you receive, but 50% of what decides the outcomes within your healthcare are based on your zip code. In fact, 70% of everything that is going to happen to you from a healthcare perspective has nothing to do with the care you receive or the genetics you have. All of those things are social determinants. And as we look at COVID-19 and see the disparate impact on people of color, we are called to look at that in a much more critical way, because it's a pandemic.
Wow. Couldn't agree more with what you just shared, Carlos. The social determinants of health are vastly overlooked by many people who would like to ascribe the disparities in health or education or food access to other reasons, right? So your point is spot on. And when we think about COVID-19, all of the pre-existing social determinants of health have only exacerbated the disparate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. Bringing this to the education space, we see that in many of our cities, black and brown kids are being treated as products on an assembly line. And that assembly line is to prepare them, as you mentioned, for compliant, often low-wage jobs that somebody has to do. So let's just leave it to them and they will do that. Let's make them not question the origin of things. Let's relegate Black history to the month of February, or maybe a day in February, if at all. Let's have them thinking that Christopher Columbus discovered America. Like all of these kinds of things that are designed to reinforce the dominant narrative that really relies on a degree of Anglocentricity, that the white narrative is normative, is standard, is right, and that everything that is non-white is not right. And that does do a lot of harm and causes a lot of trauma to black and brown students and their families, because they carry into their workplaces this notion that they are worth no more than the value of what they produce, right? And so we have really created an economic environment where human beings are not really as much human as they are pieces of property almost a newer, gentler version of slavery. We think about people producing labor for wages, whether those wages are fair or not, and we put more value on the doing part of being human than the being part of being human. So, in the education space, we see that there's a need for our black and brown children to not only have access to quality education, but to have access to personhood, full liberated personhood, not thinghood, but personhood. They need to be treated as people with interests and dreams and goals and values and aspirations and promise. And that is something that, unfortunately, an assembly line approach to education doesn't provide. On the assembly line, you are one of 30 kids who I need to pass on to the next room. But what I am learning in my time with you and Naisha, learning about the philosophy that underlies Community First School, it is really a space where you're saying you are a human being, you are a student, you are a member of our community, as is your household, right? You all are members of this community, and we seek to serve you, to sharpen you, to enrich you, but also to include you and to center your experience as your child, as your family grows together. So this is really exciting. I am beside myself with excitement because, as you can imagine, I have the opportunity to talk with a lot of organizations about change socially in this moment. How do we diversify our board? How do we diversify our executive ranks? And what a lot of people are thinking about is reform. How do I change things around the edges so that we are able to create the illusion of progress? And what you're doing is saying we're not trying to reform a broken system. We're trying to actually build what we think is a just, equitable system. We're not asking for the existing system to be more inclusive and more equitable. We're building one of our own. And so I'm just thrilled that you're even doing this, and would encourage those who are joining us in the conversation to find ways to support the important work that is getting ready to launch in Hartford later this year.
You know, you mentioned...
I'm glad that you mentioned that, and just for by way of our viewing audience on Facebook and YouTube, please join in the conversation with your questions and comments, and we will get to them a little later on in the discussion. But Dr. Pierce, what you just mentioned, you know, we're talking about purpose, and it's so fundamental to personhood. But we're talking about it against the backdrop of a system that has been designed to totally ignore our personhood of Black and brown people. Right. And so, you know, our response to that is Community First School and thinking about doing education different. But we know that we are one school, and there is a system in which we're talking about. And as I look at your work and your work in talking to executives and different companies, you know, you're meeting people at a place where they have already kind of been set, you know, and so you're interrupting a thought process, a pattern, a mindset. You're interrupting it. And as you were stating, you know, Community First School is trying to begin that process, level setting from a different place. But how could we imagine resetting the system or reforming the system? Does it take more Community First schools, or is it possible to and is it possible in this moment? Like, are we in that moment where it's possible to not just do small reforms or slow reforms, but actually change systems, and in particular, the education system, to really get at what we're because it's education is at the root of a lot of other systems. So it's our economic system, our workforce system, right? So it's really fundamental. Education is like the center of all of those other systems. So how do we begin, or how could we start to think about changing these other systems?
Sure. Well, I think there are some leaders who act in systems, and there are some leaders who act on systems. And by that, I mean there are some people who would take the approach of embedding themselves within a system almost in an intrapreneurial way, not an entrepreneur, but an intrapreneur, someone who says, I'm going to go within the system and try to change it from the inside out. And then there are others who extract themselves from the system and choose to act independently and in some cases on the system. Whichever path you take, I think everyone is looking for a North Star. Everyone is looking for an exemplar of the way it could be if done correctly, right? And so whether it is in the system or outside of the existing system, I think, frankly, organizations, schools like yours, that are choosing to start from a clear values foundation to build up have a perhaps easier chance of building the prototype that can then be used as a point of proof or evidence that this philosophy does actually work. We can actually outperform the entrenched system on all the metrics that they say they care about, plus some other ones that we actually recognize are more important. And that becomes a compelling rationale for other schools, other systems, perhaps even across the country, to take a look at what's happening in North Hartford, Connecticut, and say, there's a model out there, there's a North Star. Now, at the same time, we recognize that's going to take some time. And there are people who are more than likely within Hartford Public Schools, Boston Public Schools, Chicago Public Schools, and other public school districts that are saying, I have the same vision, help me get from where I am to where we can be. And certainly Rome was not built in a day. The Titanic does not pivot on a dime, but I tell you what we have seen in the last few months is that organizations, major, vast institutions, have pivoted from having people get on buses, planes, trains, and in automobiles to come to offices to work 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours a day, to having all those people sit behind computer screens working from home all day long. That pivot happened in weeks. Northwestern University and many other universities around the world, that operated by having students in chairs and teachers in those same rooms at the front of those classrooms, pivoted from having students in seats to having students' faces on screens in 2 weeks' time. So, I am fully and thoroughly convinced that rapid institutional change can happen when there is political will to make such change happen. And what people recognized was that these changes were not just changes that we wanted to make all along. Quite frankly, many people were skeptical about work from home or skeptical about virtual learning. They were skeptical about it. And that shows that when there's an economic impetus for change, when you can create a clear enough picture of the economic value of making a certain set of changes, it creates a lot more interest, let's say, in making those changes in a sustainable and rapid fashion. I'll tell you that, quite honestly, the economic argument seems to be getting more play. People's favorite color is not so much white, black, or brown, it's green. Yet, at the same time, this is where we have to have the moral clarity to recognize that these issues are not purely economic, but they are moral in nature. And the decisions that we make about the economics and about how money flows and about what is right for people have to first be made upon a moral foundation. I'll just say this last point and we can keep moving. As we look at our society over the last few months, especially in the onset of COVID-19 and the March and early April timeframe in the United States, you heard a lot of people giving lots and lots of appreciation to those who were deemed quote-unquote essential workers, right? Our doctors, those who are working in the health sciences, and we had a lot of people who were in white-collar, celebrated professions who we thought of as essential workers. But what we weren't paying as much attention to were the delivery people, the folks who are working in public sanitation, the folks who are working in the grocery supply chain, farmers, and others who were just doing the things to make society function. A lot of those people were black and brown, and a lot of those people did not have the luxury of working from home. They did not have the luxury of putting their health and their family's well-being ahead of putting food on the table and earning a wage. So, as we think about how our economy has been working and sustained, and the people who we have been applauding as essential workers are the very same people whose rights to personhood we actually didn't care about a whole lot as a society just 90 days before, right? So this is really a moment to reset and to think about COVID-19 not as a long blizzard, but perhaps as the dawn of a new ice age. To think about this in Game of Thrones terms, right? To think about this as not just a disruption, but as the inauguration of a new era that invites us to think and act and interact and relate in new ways.
I think we need to be careful throughout this moment, though, because we're not going back to school the same way it was either. And one of the great things about Community First is from the beginning, we wanted to be outside the classroom 50% of the time. Now, that was in the community, not necessarily from home, although we did have a significant technology platform that we wanted to engage in. But it was really about being hands-on, having learning be experiential so that critical thinking could grow as opposed to that compliant, passive assembly line that we talked about earlier. So being outside the classroom 50% of the time is now what you're hearing everyone talking about. You're talking about a day on, a day off, Tuesday, Thursday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 1 week on, 1 week off, half days. That's good, I think, but not if it's just a sit in the classroom the way it used to be and then go home and do the same work online that's dry and boring, which continues that compliant, passive production line. We can't do that. There has to be a different way. And the thing we need to be careful of, in Hartford Public Schools today, the data shows that most of the students don't have reliable internet. You go into a more affluent suburban neighborhood and it's extremely reliable. Most students have a phone. You know, this is your internet connection, and that's not enough if you're going to be doing work. So computers are handed out, but yet you don't have a large number of students logging on and actually doing the work with that computer that's been handed out, especially if the internet is suspect. So we can't go to a new method which helps more affluent suburban neighborhoods, but is detrimental to urban, less affluent neighborhoods. We have to be careful that as we change school, we understand the context of those we serve, which is another piece Community First School is looking at. It's not about just implementing a change and saying, okay, everyone just get along with the change. It's about what is the context of the people you serve and how are you making sure that your changes fit that context. You talked about a Eurocentric or Anglocentric education. That's been the education that's been forced on people, even if they have no connection to that whatsoever, when what we really need is a global-centric or one that identifies and values ethnicities and cultures, especially of those in the communities that we serve. So if you could talk a little bit to some of those inhibitors that we have to be able to overcome, the purpose of education can't just be to change. It has to be to change with purpose.
That's right. I mean, you have just pointed out the major challenge of structural racism. And many people in this COVID moment and as the global and certainly very highly concentrated national unrest around racialized violence and injustice has taken, truly captivated the national consciousness, I think we have to think about the role of systemic racism. And a lot of people would love to be able to throw a program, write a check, start an initiative that would get at this issue, but it is much deeper. As Naisha mentioned earlier, you cannot disentangle education from economic development. In communities where education quality is at the lowest points and economic opportunity are low, you also find at the same time that public safety needs and health and human services needs are high, right? And in communities where public safety and health and human services needs tend to be lower, it's because there are stronger economic opportunities and better access to quality education across the board, right? So there is an interweaving. You cannot disentangle one of these from the other. You have to turn the dials all at the same time. In order to make this move, we've got to be able to take a look at the foundations upon which America has been established. And the story of America, if we read it, has been written with the ink of racialized violence. Black inferiority, lack of black personhood are literally baked into the Constitution of the United States, if we go all the way back to the foundation. And many of the institutions that exist now have perpetuated that. When you think about structural racism, we're thinking about a system within which public policy, institutional norms and practices, and dominant norms and narratives all conspire to perpetuate racial inequity. It privileges whiteness and makes whiteness normative. And we see this in social and political and economic and organizational systems of all kinds. So part of this is to be able to name it and be willing to do something about it. And I know that white privilege is a very difficult term for a lot of people. It creates a lot of angst, and a lot of people would love to find synonyms that will help them feel better about what the actual notion of white privilege is about. No one is asking anyone to feel bad about the race that they are in, about the skin that they're in. No one's asking you to feel bad about a choice that you did not make. Like, no one picked their skin. At the same time, what the conversation is about is trying to help all of us to acknowledge that given the skin we're in, there is an invisible knapsack of either advantages or disadvantages that come strictly based on the skin we're in. And I don't know as much about Hartford, Connecticut as I do about Chicago, but in Chicago, and I imagine Hartford is likely similar in this regard, race and class are tied very closely together. And that also is very much connected with zip code. So when you're talking about these things, we have to be honest about the data. And at the same time, be honest about the fact that given the data, which we have had abundantly for centuries now, that data don't make decisions. People make decisions. And so it is when our hearts have been touched by the data and have been touched by the stories, not of exceptional black people. Like, oh, Barack Obama, he's an exception. Or the pastor at the local church, he's an exception. Or someone like Naisha, oh, she's an exception. Like, I mean, she's not like the rest of them. It's getting beyond those kinds of narratives of black exceptionalism to say, no matter how exceptional you think any black person you know or have heard of may be, the reality is they're still black in America. And they are still subject to the same disparities, the same inequality, the same inequities, the same discrimination, the same prejudice, the same presumption of guilt, the same presumption of lack of personhood that their forefathers and foremothers have experienced in this country for the last 400 years. So this is something we've got to tackle head on. We can't sidestep the issue.
Can you talk a little bit about how microaggressions factor into that?
Sure. So the term microaggressions, it's this idea of small slights that add up over the course of a day or over the course of a lifetime that on their own are not individually big enough of a deal to make an issue out of. For example, you're in a meeting. Let's just take this out of the racial construct for just a moment to kind of give people perhaps a different lens at this. If we're talking about being in a predominantly male organization and you're a woman at the table, you're the only woman in the executive team, and you share an idea, and the people at the table kind of just whistle back at you like, wow, nice legs, and then they go on to have someone else restate your idea and not give you credit for your idea. That could be considered for some a quote-unquote microaggression. That someone giving you a compliment is not enough to report to someone, so you would say, and to have someone steal your idea and repackage it as their own is not big enough to report, so someone would say. That's the idea of a microaggression. I don't like microaggression as a term because what it does is it minimizes the impact of these episodes on the psyche and personhood of the people who are targeted with them. So I understand the notion of a microaggression, but all of these really in aggregate are macroaggressions. They are things that do great violence and harm to the psychology, to the sociology, to the anthropology of our communities. And what I think is really important in the context of a community first school is that you're able to say with our youngest community members, our youngest citizens, right? And I use citizen not as a documentation status frame, but really as a citizen of the global village, right? That they deserve to operate in an environment that is free of these subtle reminders that they are inferior, or that their people are inferior, that they are other, that they are less than, and that they are not worthy simply by virtue of where they live or what they look like, right? So this happens in workplaces, this happens in schools, it happens in communities, it happens in every institution and sector of society.
Very, very. I want to dive into that a little bit more, but I also wanted to just recognize that we're at the halfway mark, and I appreciate all the conversation that's happening thus far here, and also on our Facebook feed. We have a few comments that have come in, and as I said at the beginning, I wanted to leave time and just a few more minutes to get to some of the comments and responses. But overall, I think we're seeing a lot of synergy when it comes to the comments and the questions that are coming in. And I want to encourage folks to keep it coming, and also to come back later on this evening, where we're going to continue the conversation from 6 to 7:30 with a full range of other panelists from Hartford, and doing work in the community and helping to put the community or build that community. The faces of the community are going to be in that panel discussion. But we are at the halfway mark, and I did want folks to know that we are opening Community First School in August. We will be coming back, and we'll talk about that a little later on in tonight's program, about how do we come back safely, how do we continue to build and reimagine in the midst of COVID-19 and everything else. So we're going to talk about that, but we are opening, and we are independent school, and that means we rely on you. We rely on folks, individuals, to support and open the doors. We have real costs like teacher salaries and electricity bills and things like that, which traditionally in a public school, the state pays for, but independent schools rely upon donations from like-minded individuals or supportive community members, all of you out there watching who want to see something like Community First, what we're talking about, like the foundational values that we're building Community First School on. You want to see more schools like this. This is just the first. We're opening in North Hartford to serve North Hartford children and families. And that is going to take all of us working together to do that. And so on your screen, there's a way in which you can contribute. Text to CFS-2020 to 44321, and that will immediately get you a link to a secure website where you can make your donation.
And the first 10 donations, we are going to send you an autographed copy of Dr. Pierce's The Purpose Path book. So please reach out, text CFS-2020 to number 44-321 and help us launch our school for the community August 31st.
So Tim and Naisha, one of the things that really excited the president of St. Francis and Trinity Health of New England at large is medicine. We try to practice evidence-based medicine. And that means that you have to know what the research shows and look at it from a analytical perspective. What we were very excited to hear is you all will begin looking at your project in the school using evidence-based analysis, both on the curriculum that you develop and also on the outcomes that are a result of how you've changed that curriculum to meet the needs, the individualized needs of the students in North Hartford. And one of the things I think we talked about is the assembly line approach to education not being an appropriate thing anymore. But I really liked, as I spoke with Tim, to understand that An individualized education plan will be developed for each child within that school, and that's going to take their uniqueness and their own personal circumstance and allow it to be a benefit rather than a detractor from the education they'll receive. So we're very proud of what it is that you're doing, and we wish you the best success as it goes forward.
You know, I've watched students who were traumatized by their school system, and I watched them under desks, cowering, hiding, crying. And I watched a different approach. You know, there were times I was able to come in as a consultant and work with students on an individualized basis. And I watched students who went from that place of trauma to a place of leadership in a matter of weeks, not months, just by recognizing the individual greatness of that person. And as I was reading Dr. Pierce's book, you start to feel and understand like how important it is if someone believes in your purpose. If someone believes that you're not just on the assembly line, but you were created for something great. Who knows what it is? But everyone has that uniqueness inside them and that greatness inside them. And it's not our job to push a curriculum into them. It's our job to take out that unique greatness within and help the student to recognize at every age. So whether it's kindergarten or 12th grade, senior year, there's something about you that makes you special and unique that you were designed to do. And we believe that. And therefore, if we can help you find that and understand that and embrace that, then you are going to be very different in the end than if you're just on that assembly line. So yes, we do have individualized learning plans for each student. You know, in the special ed world, it's called an IEP. Well, I like that idea for every student. Why should every student not have an individualized learning plan that's based upon their uniqueness? So that's another area where we reach to parents, because in education, parents are usually kind of kept at arm's distance. They're not trusted. And in urban education, oftentimes parents are kept at arm's distance because if they actually got to see what was going on inside, they would be very upset. And we want to keep them away because we don't want them to really see the negligence. That's the God's honest truth. And we're afraid that they're going to cause a scene. Well, I'll tell you what, if what was going on in an urban school was happening in a suburban affluent community, there'd be a whole bunch of upset parents and there'd be a whole bunch of people screaming and yelling. But that's seen differently in urban education. If you raise your voice in urban education, you're a problem, mad black person. If you do that in a suburban area, you're a dignified, white, concerned mother, right? That stuff has to end. So what we're looking to do is create a space where parents can be listened to. The experience of a parent on Albany Ave, which is a space here in North Hartford, is equal to a teacher who went out of NEAG Teachers College at UConn. They're different experiences, but they're equal. And once we recognize the equality of the experience, we can learn from each other and we can build an education that truly embraces parents. So, Dr. Pierce, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that a little bit, purpose is not just about the student, it's about the family and the community, and building that in to a school system, I think, will create that reason for being that you wanted to talk about.
Can I add one thing to your question for Dr. Pierce? One of the things that I struggle with and think we have to understand more is internalized worthlessness. Mm. And as people of color, there is a propensity to have an internalized worthlessness that I think has to be overcome in order to realize the benefit of what Tim and Aisha and the Community First School really want to pull out of families and children.
Mm. Wow. Thank you all for the lunchtime softballs. I mean, this is cutting to the heart of it, right? So this whole idea of internalized worthlessness, I mean, that's a powerful and loaded phrase. Here in Chicago, we just had one of the most violent weekends in a while, where over 100 people were shot, and a lot of the people who were shot were black, and presumably a lot of the people who were shooting were black, and a lot of people have come out and said, well, if you're going to march to hold the police accountable for shooting and killing unarmed black people, you should also march to hold the black people who are shooting unarmed black people accountable. Peace. I think we cannot hide the shooters in our grandmother's basements and give them safe harbor. Yet at the same time, we have to recognize that a lot of the black on black crime that we see is just a regurgitation of the internalized trauma that has come with this internalized worthlessness. I am worthless, therefore this other black life that looks like mine is also worthless. And that, I think, precipitates a lot of the crime that we see. So this question is profound, that it's not just how do you take a young person and instill in them a sense of worth and dignity, but how do you have the conversation with mom and dad or parent or guardian or grandma or uncle to have the same perspective of themselves? Because if the parent and the family, the network of adults who are in this person's life, this young person's life, don't share that perspective, they will undo what you do in the classroom at Community First School through what they say at home, which is really the first classroom, right? So there is a conversation to be had to say to parents and families, no, you are not worth your income. Your income is not a measurement of your worthiness as a human being. The color of your skin, no matter what you see on television, is not a metric of worth or lack thereof vis-a-vis what other people say. Your inherent dignity and your worth come from the fact that you have been created by God. You are a child of God. God did not make a mistake in allowing you to be on the planet for such a time as this. No matter what your skin color, your gender, or whatever other social identity markers we want to pick and choose and create a haves or have-nots view of, you are here on purpose. Whether your mom and dad intended to conceive you and whether they call you a quote-unquote accident or not, you are not accidental. You have survived what others have not. You are here. You are alive at this moment in time. And therefore, you have not only a responsibility, but you also have a reason to celebrate the very fact you're alive. Life itself is a miracle. None of us, even on this call today in this conversation, are making our own hearts beat. None of us are willing our brains to connect the dots of this conversation. This is all miraculous, right? And when we look at the fact that each of us is loved and has the capacity to love and can't take credit for who we are, where we are, what we are. Yes, we've done work, we've worked hard, we've had access to opportunities, we have applied ourselves and all the things. But at the end of the day, none of us has truly earned everything we have. If the truth be told, a lot of the things that we do deserve, we have actually avoided in terms of the negative repercussions of poor choices that we've made or other things that would otherwise take us off course. And when we recognize that we actually are more in common than different, in that regard at least. I'm not advocating for color blindness, but what I'm saying is that when we actually recognize that as fellow humans, we all have that sort of inherent dignity, worth, and value, that's a message that we can share with parents and with kids so that when they go home, they are not hearing a different soundtrack than what they're hearing in the classroom. And ultimately, the parent's voice is going to win out no matter what.
For a moment there, I think I heard the doctor sit down and the pastor stand up, but I was blessed by it all the same.
Well, I appreciate that. That's part of my approach to this work. I don't segment and partition myself. I don't have a moment where I take my soul and I leave it in the parking lot when I go to teach. Neither do I leave my brain in the parking lot when I go into a pulpit to preach. I try to do what Parker Palmer calls living an undivided life, where you don't have to toggle back and forth and send a version of yourself into the space that you think they're going to expect. You don't have to have this kind of mask wearing and changing that we oftentimes engage in. I'm able to be me wherever I am. And that's part of what I talk about in the purpose path, but also part of what I encourage young children and families to think about. Creating a space where their young people can be celebrated, not tolerated, in an authentic way, not as a fake version of them, but as the real version that is worthy of being nurtured, loved, and pushed forward to be all they can be.
And I think that really is ultimately what we envision. And I say we, community first, like all of us envision a world in which we can show up as our authentic selves, because we understood purpose. Like, so it's all very fundamental to what we believe, because if that's at the root, we can be our authentic selves and we can walk in any room. But also the room is changed. It's like we can walk into any room, but the room has changed to accept us as our authentic selves as well. So we're creating spaces and rooms and community that is going to live that out. We want to embody exactly what you just talked about, Dr. Pierce. We want to embody it through Community First School and have it be that model for others to take a look at and say, we can do this. This can be in way, but it really starts with imagining all of these different things have to happen together, because you have to imagine a society that's different than the one that we currently have.
That's right.
The creation of psychological safety the creation of a psychological safety zone is so important for that to be realized.
Yeah. And part of the work here in creating that psychological safety is undoing the narratives that have caused trauma to the very people you are trying to serve. Mm-hmm. So part of this is demolishing unjust systems and unjust and not equitable ways of thinking, feeling, being, and doing, and at the same time being the lead architects of a new system and changing those narratives that have been within people for generations is no small task. But I do believe, as Carlos mentioned, the pastor in me cannot help but to take note of the fact that the transformation of the human heart is an inside job and all things are possible.
I love that you said demolish and re-architect. We could really almost close with that. We have 3 more minutes, and we want to be true to our time for everyone who's watching, and also for you guys who've given us already an hour of your time during the busy day of life and work. Naisha, anything off the questions from Facebook or YouTube that we want to address before we wrap it up?
I want to say, with no slight to anyone, in the last 3 minutes of the call, the conversation just got so good. But Dr. Maya Bowen had a question about curriculum. I think we kind of covered. We had Richard Sussman, who was just calling out the contrast of the conversation that we're having versus what we see in the community. There is a contrast, and so that's very real. We had Beresford Wilson talking about the similar idea, of change. So I think overall, there's a lot of synergy in the comments that come through, and I think we addressed a lot of the kind of questions that they had. But again, like, we could stay here for another hour if we really want to get into curriculum, and but you can also just visit, call Tim or myself, and we can have that conversation about what does the curriculum of a school need to look like if we are going to be purpose-based. If we have a purpose-based education, what would that curriculum actually look like? And we have it. We actually mapped it out. We know what it should look like when you are purpose-driven and you value the identity in the context of individuals and see their personhood. There's a way that you shape and can shape that curriculum in that whole school. And that's what Community First School is. So
we were very fortunate to have Central Connecticut State University not only support our curriculum work, but learn from our curriculum work. We learned together with community folks. We brought community folks in on the conversations, and it was all about how do we establish a sense of value in community, family, and self. That's one of our ultimate ideas within the curriculum. And how do we make it engaging and make sure that it addresses social justice in education? That's really the foundation of what we tried to do. The details are much more centered on insects and visiting Keeney Park and all the stuff that little kids like to do. But there is a strong sense of social justice. and intrinsic community and family value that we've talked about often today. So I appreciate that question, and would be happy to discuss that further, get into the details offline.
Yeah, because unfortunately, we are out of time. But I do want to thank Dr. Nicholas Pierce and Carlos Brown for joining us for this conversation. We do have some books. We have The Purpose Path, authored by Dr. Pierce. If you want to hear more about understanding your purpose, you can reach out to us, Tim. Is that how we want to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the first 10 donations that come in today, I haven't checked the site right now in the last couple minutes, but the first 10 donations get a free autograph copy from Dr. Pierce.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that's it, Tim. I think we're at time. We are exactly at 1 o'clock. So thank you so much, Dr. Pierce and Carlos Brown, and our true heartfelt thanks to you both, and in particular Trinity Health, St. Francis Hospital, for supporting the first part of our virtual summit 2020. Please come back at 6 p.m. where we continue this conversation. I think we started it off with this powerful lunchtime talk, and we're going to continue it through this evening. So please come back and join us right here, Community First School Facebook page, and also on YouTube. Both any way you want to reach us, we'll be there live tonight, again, taking your questions and comments and continuing this dialogue to really reimagine, respond, rebuild, and reimagine education for Hartford students right now in the midst of COVID-19 and everything else.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
You bet.
Thank you.